So smart people with degrees from all kinds of universities and whatnot call this thing that we're living in the managerial state. Okay,
Yeah.
and you that sounds very smart. You called the cathedral. Um, in two words, could you, like, for the audience who maybe are dummies like me, can you explain what that is? What's the idea?
Yeah, I think, if you talked to a someone who worked in, the managerial state, and I have a slight beef to pick with that's James Burnham's language, and I have a slight beef to pick with it in specific. I think that, if you talk to most sort of experts in the subject in DC, they would want you to say administrative state instead of the deep state or whatever. Or, my term cathedral is slightly different because it refers to, like, essentially the brains of that organism, which is journalism and academia, but the body of the organism is the administrative state. And sort of journalism and academia are powerful because this enormous body of the state recognizes them as its only valid brain. Something that's true if it's in journalism, it's science if it comes out of academia.
Wait.
Right. But, executing this thing, executing the sort of the actions of government is this thing that we call the administrative state, which is really a sort of kind of cancerous mutation of what used to be the executive branch. And really what distinguishes an executive branch is that it's executive. It's run on the basis of top-down command, like a military, or like a well-run military. It's like the president wants this to be done. He says, hey, Secretary of the Interior, I'd like you to turn all of Missouri into luxury condos and squash courts. And, but then it gets done, right? That is not the way that the U.S. government works. The U.S. government does not have an executive branch whose mission is to, like, get things done by, like, commands trickling down from the president, who is the commander of all. The United States has what is essentially a giant legislative branch whose structure and policy and budget is dictated by the Congress. And this is why you don't see anyone lobbying really the White House. They lobby on Capitol Hill because Capitol Hill is what actually controls this government. And so you have this sort of thing which is nominally under the command of your elected officials, but in fact has sort of been purely self-referential, really largely since the death of FDR. And it's been growing less competent continuously since the death of FDR. So, it's the sort of thing that is the reality of what you see when you're waving your beautiful American flag. This is like DC. This is and no one could possibly create this thing, or no one would possibly want to invent this thing if it didn't exist. It can sort of only be explained by sort of bizarre historical reasons. And just
Wait.
to
Hold on.
just
Yeah,
sure.
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Just to sort of classify it in historical terms, when you have a government in which basically power is a matter of process, then power, if it's a matter of process, is sort of the process sort of pretends to be inhuman or above humanity, or, like,
Right, we're all following
and
flow
what
charts, right?
and yeah, right. And what that process really, but humans are always involved, and what that process translates into is effectively the governance of those who have the right to participate in the process. And the right to participate in the process is essentially a sort of rank within the system. And the identity of a regime is defined by its sense of rank in this sense. And so you would say that there are three kinds of government. There's a monarchy oligarchy and democracy, monarchy being the rule of one, like a king or a dictator, oligarchy being the rule of many, and democracy being the rule of all. And what we see clearly is that the processes that drive this regime, this state, very clearly correspond to the rule of many. They are basically sort of networks of the people, the stakeholders, the people with kind of the right to weigh in. Capitol Hill, of course, has this lobbying apparatus that allows, a sort of external input. But when we think of the country as a democracy, we imagine foolishly that the politicians we elect are in charge of this thing, whereas they are really just, for the most part, standing on top of it. And their authority over it, well, and by this I mean the authority of the presidency over it, well, it's sort of considerably greater than the authority of Charles III over the United Kingdom. It can't really be compared in any way to even the authority of George III, let alone the authority of Henry VIII.
Cromwell, right?
And this is important because we sort of regularly write as if President Biden had the powers of Henry VIII. We were always like, Biden did this, Biden did that, the Biden administration did this, President Biden today decided, right? And so, we have this kind of figure of kind of the head of state who, despite being the chief executive of the biggest organization in the world, spends a third of his day on photo ops. And is sort of like having this role of kind of a ceremonial executive.
Wait.
But in reality, there is no executive.
Hold on. It's not like a secret to anybody that's got a pulse that the presidency in the U.S. is weekend at Bernie's effectively, and this whole thing runs itself. But I have a question.
Sure.
About Burnham. We mentioned Burnham.
Yes.
Burnham had a thing called the Iron Law of Oligarchy, which basically said, I'm giving you my...
Yeah, I mean, that dates back to Robert Mitchell's, half a century earlier. But yeah, it's essentially...
I'll give the midwit version. No matter who formally runs stuff, in practice, a small cohesive group of people have to run stuff. Otherwise, stuff won't get run. So, that being so, who cares? Monarchy, democracy, oligarchy.
So no. People who say this are simply deficient because they have not experienced the blessed light of a real monarchy. And the thing is that the iron law of oligarchy basically tells you that democracy kind of collapses into oligarchy. That democracy is very unstable at any kind of scale. Really, it's best to regard democracy as a sort of momentary force rather than an ongoing force. You can't really base a government on democracy. You can use the force of a large number of people acting at the same time, not as a kind of continuous power output. It's not a battery, it's a capacitor. You can use that to basically tip power from one oligarchic or monarchic regime to another. But basically, the only two kinds of regime are oligarchic and monarchic. And I think when you look at, sort of major American companies, you see that there's sort of very clear, you do see a lot of companies in which monarchy is kind of descended into oligarchy, and the company is in practice kind of run by a gang of high to mid-level leaders, and there isn't really a strong CEO. You'll see, sometimes they'll call this like a peacetime CEO, which just really means peacetime is just a nice way of saying right? And then you have sort of the wartime CEOs, the Musks, people like that. These are the people who like build companies who,
I read Horowitz's book too, right? But wait, hold on. I got a question. You're saying that a democracy is just a transitional phase between, different kinds of oligarchy.
Well, I think that wait, there's a terminological question deeper than that, because when we say, yes, we can say democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy are classifications of regime, but they're really kinds of force within sort of any regime. And so when you're an oligarchy, you have to prevent sort of democratic and monarchical force from appearing, or especially prevent the two from combining.
Yeah.
And the because monarchy is sort of always has this kind of, I mean, the people have to love the king, or who even is
Yeah,
he,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. He's got to have magnetic appeal. Right.
Right. And so the like when you describe democracy as a kind of force, you're more saying what are the conditions under which this force operates. So, for example, if you look at the attitude toward democracy, let's say either in the Roman Empire around 100 AD or China today, you have definitely civilized, sophisticated people who are just like, this idea obviously makes no sense and is retarded and has nothing to do with me, right?
Well, throughout most of human
And
history, right? I mean,
yeah, throughout most of human history,
we
like
had
the
Athenian
idea,
democracy, and then for two
as
thousand years,
Charles as
right?
yeah as and it was when it happened, when Athenian democracy happened, everyone regarded it as a disaster,
Yeah, because they were
and
psychopaths. They were psychopaths. Hey,
yeah,
let's
yeah, yeah,
invade
yeah.
all the other Greek cities. Let's take the rabble and have them kill everybody of quality, and then we're going to do the same exact thing here in Athens in the middle of an existential war. We're just going to put
Yeah,
our
yeah.
leaders to death because we all just voted on it. Then wake up next morning and go, oh man,
But
what did we do?
they hadn't come up with a trans thing, right? They didn't do trans.
Who actually did was Roman emperors like Heliogabalus and that other weirdo.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
there's
yeah,
your
yeah,
monarchy too.
yeah. There you go. There
So
you
wait,
go. There
hold
you go.
on,
Yeah, yeah.
hold on.
Monarch quality is pretty important, but
This
the so when you're, just to summarize, to answer your question before we drift off into Heliogabalus and the sexuality of Roman emperors, right? The sort of the clear point is that when you look at this system, you're looking at this kind of fundamentally oligarchic regime